Welcome to Know What I Mean. My name is Oscar.
My name's George, and in this episode, we discuss us giving unwanted advice to our girlfriends, the shallow wisdom of Instagram, and when to be silent. Oh, that was the cringiest intro so far. Let's get into the episode.
So the quote for this week is, "A fool can give more advice in a day than a wise man can follow in a year." And it's by Sangharakshita. Sangharakshita is the founder of the Buddhist movement that I'm part of. And I ironically saw this quote on Instagram, even though I often put down Instagram quotes. And I picked this quote out of advice fatigue. I consume a lot of content, and obviously I'm on Instagram quite a lot, and it seems that I'm constantly being bombarded through the algorithm, I guess, with life advice. It's not like there's terrible intentions there. It's just that there's a hollowness to it. It's basically what I think this quote is saying is that it's very easy to give advice, but it's very hard to follow it. That's what I think the crux is. And I guess both of us have consumed an enormous amount of self-help content and really been looking to improve ourselves. I think at a certain point, I found that when it comes to particularly life advice, it becomes oversaturated. And actually to really follow very simple life advice is hard. It's life's work. So just as an example, you might get a little Instagram thing, which is just like a nice photo, and it's just like says, be present, or it says, be kind, or whatever it might be. That is a lifelong commitment. That's not like one of 5 things that you can do to be happier is be kind or whatever. Like that's something that people have been throughout human history tackling it's something they're trying to follow day in, day out. It's very significant, but it seems to me that we're very willing to dish out that sort of advice in a way that it almost trivializes how significant it actually is and how much effort it actually takes to follow advice like that. So I guess it's partly a bit of frustration, a feeling like I'm having all this information kind of crammed into me all the time.
Yeah, that's interesting that you picked out the thing of just being bombarded with all this advice that in itself can actually be good advice. And when I was looking at this quote, I realized that it's not a quote about bad advice. It doesn't actually say anything in the quote about this fool giving bad advice. Imagine if you're in a bar talking to some fool, but actually it turns out that they seem to know a lot of stuff. They've ingested lots of books on spirituality and self-development, and they can recite all these things, and they can actually say lots of things which individually are very wise and can be completely true. They could be literally quoting the Buddha, but you can see that the folly in it comes from thinking that you can do all of these things at once and taking them so lightly. The quote is not about bad advice. It's about the wisdom of choosing the few simple pieces of advice that you can actually consistently follow.
It's a good point to make. I think that basically the world is full of incredible advice, but in a way we don't need any fresh advice. We've got all the advice and wisdom that we would need written down, but actually following it, actually dedicating yourself to something is a hugely significant thing in life. I listen to quite a lot of entrepreneurial podcasts to get myself inspired to do things. But I think part of me wanting to listen to them is also wanting to throw enough stuff at myself to see if any of this good advice will stick. But that's kind of a bit of a separate point. But there's one podcast in particular that is just chocker full with advice. It may be what their listeners are looking for partly, but I don't think that's the main reason why people listen actually to this particular podcast. But it's just like in one intro, there's more advice there than is conceivable to follow through your whole life. There's so many things captured in what you should be doing or what you ought to be doing that it becomes almost meaningless because it's not possible that the host could actually be following all the things that they're advising. I think that's partly what prompted me to pick this quote and get into it, was just thinking like, man, like this is just not possible. It's hard enough to get one good habit that requires so much work to really integrate something like that, let alone this ridiculous list.
And I think that can be really detrimental, like that information overwhelm, because there's such an abundance of great ideas that can be accessed so easily. It's very easy to be like going like, oh, let me find a bit here, let me find a bit here, let me save this, like this piece of wisdom. It's a feeling of one day it's all just going to click into place once you've collected enough little bits of wisdom. And I think it's because of the abundance of it. People value things that are more scarce. That's just a fact of human nature. People value more things that are harder to come by. So by virtue of that, if you're, say, a Chinese peasant living hundreds of years ago, and you manage to get yourself to a Zen monastery and you listen to the things that they say, you're going to go so much deeper because you're starved for actual information. You know, obviously you have your experience, which is just as rich as anyone living now. But in terms of actual bits of information and wisdom, it's so scarce. So any little thing that someone says, any piece of wisdom, if you're committed to it, you're just going to go deep into that and just extract everything you can from that. Whereas if you're in this buffet, you can kind of be like, oh, I'll have a bit of that. And like, and you don't go deeper than it. And there's so many, like the Instagram quotes, which is funny seeing as now we do post our quotes on Instagram.
Yeah, this whole thing's quite
meta, calling ourselves out.
Yeah.
But you know, you scroll down and you see a quote. Imagine it's a Buddha quote that like some people have spent thousands of hours in silence contemplating those few words.
Yeah.
And now people will literally consume it for less than 1 second and maybe tap like and then keep scrolling. And just think about the difference in how is that piece of wisdom going to affect you if you consume it for 1,000 hours of dedicated focus versus like half a second of scattered attention. It's still the same content. It's still exactly the same. It's just words, but it's how you put those words together and integrate them into your life that is where the wisdom comes.
Yeah, it's so true. There's such a draw towards this idea that the more content I consume, then the more likely it is I'll actually ingest it. But actually, it's the opposite, really. Pick wisely what you choose to consume and really dedicate yourself to it. I think it's also really interesting, this area of the power of silence or very, very little information. I think you touched on it there, is that if you were starved of information and you get information, then the value that you put on that is so high. So in Buddhism, there's this story. The Buddha holds up a flower to his Sangha, his community. They're sitting around and they're waiting for this really profound teaching, this content that is going to change them. You know, and I can imagine the sense the disciples have or the people following have is similar to the one that I might get if I pick up a self-help book or something like that. And I'm like, ooh, this is the content I need to really get something to really change my life. This is going to be it. You know, the potency of the Buddha's words and his reputation would mean that there was so much significance put on what he was going to say, right? But in this particular sermon, he picks up a flower and he just holds up the flower and he doesn't say anything. And one person in the crowd gets it. He gets that. I mean, what does he get? In Zen, it's talked about as suchness. And I guess it's in the area of just pure presence or pure mystical, magical quality of stillness and presence. And I'm laying this on afterwards. I don't know what the recognition was, but there was some power in the lack of words, the lack of explaining, and just this simple thing that he was holding up. Supposedly, the person who gets it in the group, that's the lineage of Zen. He's the first Zen teacher. And there was one other thing I wanted to mention in regards to that, was just that also this guy, Ramana Maharshi, is a really, really famous Indian guru. And he would actually only give advice or teachings to students that were less advanced, that needed something to grapple with. And for the rest of the people who had been there a while, it was just silence. It was literally just the presence of being there in his company and just being fully, richly aware in the moment.
It's like he was giving them all the information they needed and then just like, yeah, that's all the information you need. And that's a really powerful thing, to know when to shut up, when to not elaborate further. now I've become hyper aware of whether or not I'm belaboring this point, but we'll leave it there. I'm still working on it. I was thinking actually the fool can actually also be your mind. So if you think of, for example, me consuming lots of content on how to live my life, and that's not just from books and videos, but it's also from society and my family, my friends, people I've admired, all the things that I've observed as I've grown up about how someone should be. And all of this stuff is there in my head, and constantly that's what fuels thoughts. They're all based on these little things that I've heard or ideas about how I should behave in the world. And some of them run parallel to each other. Some will completely contradict each other, but they're all bouncing around and will enter your head throughout the day. And you have all these ideas coming in, but the wisdom is getting better at choosing which pieces of advice you want to put into action and actually put into the world. I guess it's a process that I'm endeavoring to do to move closer towards wisdom by becoming better at organizing my thoughts or knowing which thoughts to follow, which ones to ignore. And the foolishness can be in the trying to do all of them at once, which is definitely something that I've fallen into before.
Yeah. So with that process for you of discerning what to act on, like how does that work in practice for you?
It's been about getting clearer on what things are important to me and what things will need to be sacrificed in order to achieve that. Because having this constant flow of ideas of different things means you're keeping all of these doors open, all of these possibilities, and you're judging yourself against all these possibilities of how you could potentially be in every different dimension of your life. But it's kind of understanding, actually, I've only got a certain amount of time in the day and only a certain amount of time in my life, and I don't know how long that is. So it's really important to decide what things do I want to have in my day and what things do I want to work towards, and to just get better at bringing myself back to those things. So one practical thing that I do is I have a document that I look at every morning, which just kind of reminds me of some of the core things that contribute to me having a good day. And they're also things that I've analyzed in terms of they will also lead to a good life. And I have written down my goals for the next year or so to keep me focused on those things. And then throughout the day, I track what I'm doing, and that helps kind of align me and bring me back, because I can easily get sidetracked from a thought and follow that, and then it leads to this and leads to that. And then next thing I know, I'm somewhere completely different to where I started the day and where I would like to end the day. So it's about that process of being able to quickly bring yourself back and have that awareness and kind of be monitoring your thoughts somewhat and finding the ones that you want to follow, and just learning which thoughts often come up that often don't lead to good things, and get better at ignoring those ones.
It sounds like a discerning wisdom. You've got this flood of things coming through, and you've got a certain net that you want to hold particular aspects of what you're learning and how you're growing, and that net to allow the things that don't serve you to go through, I guess.
Yeah. A lot of it is about accepting the things you can't do that you might want to do, but just there's not enough hours in the day to also do that and do that and do that.
There was a bit that we haven't really touched on much yet, and I'm quite intrigued by, is intention when it comes to giving advice. So I think this is a really key area to all this. I think it feels really good to be the one who knows and the one to give advice and the one to be asked for advice. It seems to validate your importance in a situation. This was really not actually that long time ago, so I clearly haven't grown out of it completely. But about a year and a half ago, it was like, I was at a club. Well, it was more like a little venue, and I was quite drunk. And I started chatting to this girl about her degree, because I think we went to the same uni, or she had just graduated anyway, and she'd been doing fine art, and now she was struggling to find work. And I ended up going into this whole like monologue about how to find work. And I was a student not working. So I really wasn't in a position to be giving tips about this thing. And I could just like, I don't know, after maybe 5 minutes or something like that, I was just like, I just sound like a fucking dick. This isn't coming from a place of sincerely caring about this person or wanting to help this person. This is just coming from a place of me wanting to be seen as in the know and like cool. It was this moment of just like, this advice is meaningless. It's completely meaningless because the place that it's coming from is purely just ego. And I think that's such a pitfall with advice, and why there is so much of it is it's so tempting to use it as a means to validate ourselves, that to say wise things, it's such an easy win to get people to see you in a particular way.
I'm right there with you because I love to give advice to people all the time. It's definitely something that I do notice myself doing. It became particularly apparent when I started living with my girlfriend, because any little thing that she was doing that wasn't as efficient as it could be, I would, helpfully advise her on the best technique to cut potatoes or whatever it was. And this was surprisingly not met with gratitude, but rather annoyance that, I couldn't just let her do it her own way. It can be something that's very tempting because it feels like I'm doing it to help the other person. But I think a lot of what it is, I've realized quite recently actually, that generally I do actually like a lot of feedback and constructive criticism, because I'm particularly interested, and this might be somewhat delusional, so bear with me. But I at least think of myself as someone who really likes people giving me tips or ways to do things more efficiently or whatever. So I at least feel like I'm receptive to that sort of thing. And a lot of it is the narcissism of projecting that onto other people, expecting other people to be like me and to want to get advice on how to the most effective like potato chopping technique or something like that, rather than actually understanding the person and realizing that maybe they would be happier if I just let them do it their own way. I'm now endeavoring to give less advice, but also to actually pay attention to people and where they're at, and whether it's actually a compassionate thing to give them advice at that moment, or whether it's better to just have a fun conversation with them for an extra 5 seconds while they're, doing whatever inefficient thing they're doing. And then, appreciate the nice meal that they've cooked or whatever it is.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. I think that I have also gone through some sort of thing like that, which also was to do with living with my girlfriend as well. I think like there's something about just having your life very intertwined with someone, and you're really part of each other's existence. Yeah, you're cooking with each other, for each other. You're just sharing your life in a way that is you're not used to, I guess. And yeah, I remember early on very similar situations of just, this is just not how I would do this. And then feeling that for me, it was much clearer that it was coming from a place of being mildly irritated than anything else. Because I find it annoying when people give me advice on stuff with very minimal impact. So we're never living together, basically.
Yeah.
If it's something so minimal, I'd say the quality of the advice, the significance of it is important, how big the actual impact is. But I think for me, when giving advice, it definitely was that it frustrated me to see things being done in a way that I didn't see was effective, or I saw was contradictory. And I wanted to stop that. I was like, this is annoying. I find that this doesn't make sense to me. And so I want to change it now. And I think recognizing, because what ended up happening with that was just that me and my girlfriend would end up getting into arguments. And the thing is I could sincerely say that it wasn't a big deal to give the advice that I gave, because it's not like hurtful in any obvious way. But the energy that I was bringing to it behind that bit of advice definitely was that you're acting incorrectly, basically. That was kind of what was behind it. And so the reaction that I got was actually totally fair enough, considering that if it had been translated as your way of being is wrong, basically. If I was to translate it in that way, I'd feel very hurt if I got that sense from someone. So I think what was being reacted to was that energy that I was bringing into it. So I'm, it's been a really good learning curve for me, and just maturing and realizing like advice is a very valuable thing, and it needs to be treated with respect. It's as you said, the actual times when people are receptive to advice is tiny. It's such a small gap. Like there's so many conditions that come into play, that have to come into play to make someone actually receptive to what you're saying.
Yeah.
So there's no point just dishing it out like all of it's going to hit, and it's all really valuable, because it's not. If you're bringing the wrong intention to it, it's going to not be taken in. If the person is not in the right time of their life. I remember like I got really into Eckhart Tolle. He was like the first person I got into, who wrote a book called A New Earth and the Power of Now. Still huge fan, big fanboy. But I got into him and I was just like, everyone needs to read this. This is just life-changing, unbelievable, so powerful, right? Because it was so clear to me and so simple. I was just like, anyone can get this. Anyone who reads this will just have their life totally transformed. And I remember like one occasion where there was a family friend who was clearly quite, like there was distressing stuff going on for her. And she was very, very locked in her mind. And I was reading this book that was telling you how to free yourself from that and to be more aware of your thought and your ego and your emotional trauma, etc. I was just like, well, she would definitely benefit from this book. I mentioned it, but it was just like, in hindsight, there's no way that was the right moment to mention that, because I knew that she wasn't wanting to hear what I was saying. I just felt such an urge to share whatever that I felt was appropriate, but it wasn't at all appropriate. And there's no way that it would have been picked up in that moment. The first word that came to mind now is just kindness, of actually genuinely wanting to help people through sharing what you've learned. It's a skill, it's essentially like teaching or something like that, where you have to be both very aware of the quality of it in your own life, but also you have to be very receptive to the other person to know what is appropriate at what time and why. And it might be quite intuitive, but it's 100% a skill. Like there's so many things for everyone that have been very significant for each of us that we could all share with one another at the exact right moment. And that can be incredibly powerful, because if it's purely just at your end and it's imbalanced, like it was with Eckhart Tolle for me, then it's like giving someone an amazing meal when they're not hungry. It's like totally pointless. They're not going to eat it and it's not going to be appreciated. And you're going to feel disheartened as well if you're thinking about yourself. Like I was completely baffled that people were not into this book. I was absolutely just taken aback because it had been so significant for me. And that's disappointing. It's disappointing to give advice or try and help someone and for it to totally not work as you'd intended. It's a skill of empathy, I think, to really be a good teacher or to give the right kind of advice.
I've actually got a little story that I'd like to end on. Are you all sitting comfortably?
I'm standing very comfortably.
Beautiful. Then I'll begin. So it was a searingly hot day and a traveler was panting as they trudged up the trail. Once they got to the top of the hill, they saw an old woman happily relaxing in the shade beside a large pine tree. The old woman was very friendly, and they both got to chatting whilst protected from the bright sun by the pine on the top of the hill. The traveller knew they must continue on their journey, so they said goodbye. But just as they were leaving, the old woman looked in their eyes and said something so sincerely that it was heard with the heart and body rather than the ears. As the traveller walked down the trail into the valley, they felt better and better. The words of the old woman still filling their body and infusing their spirit in a way they had never thought possible. As this feeling continued, they started to skip along, feeling elated and joyful to be alive. They breathed the fresh air and took in the most subtle smells of nature. As they reached the bottom of the valley, they saw a bush by the side of a small stream, and there was a young man who seemed to be frantically looking around for something. The young man told the traveler that he had lost his phone, and the traveler felt uncomfortable around this nervous energy and was keen to get away. But the young man wouldn't stop talking. He told the traveler about the circumstances that led up to losing his phone and all the people and choices to blame. Eventually, the traveler managed to exit the conversation and start his ascent up the other side of the valley. As the traveler continued their ascent up the hill, they were still feeling rather disturbed and couldn't stop thinking about the young man. They thought about all of the bad things that had allegedly happened to him and how they could avoid them happening in their own life. These thoughts consumed the traveler as their vision became narrowed and grey. Finally, after the day's climb, the traveler reached the crest of the hill and saw another pine on the top of the hill. In that moment, the words of the old woman came rushing back and filled the traveler with a profound and satisfying appreciation of this moment and an excited readiness for the future. As the traveler repeated the words, they could feel them in their heart and body as they had before. As the old woman had looked them in the eyes, she had said, "Make yourself proud of today." And from then on, whenever the traveler saw or even thought of a pine tree, they were reminded of the wisdom in these simple words.
Yeah, really nice, man. I love how the quote or the poem from a couple of weeks ago was, or was it last week?
It was last week's poem, yeah.
It was last week's poem, yeah.
Yeah, I thought the imagery inspired me, yeah.
Yeah, really nice, man.
Oh, cool. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I felt myself getting a bit hot. I felt kind of nervous reading that.
Ooh. Ooh. So before next week's quote, just really wanted to thank you for listening. Every view and listen is just so appreciated. It would be great if you could subscribe if you're not already. That really helps us get up the charts. And if you could think of anyone that would appreciate this episode, please share it. And if you fancied buying us a coffee, if you're liking the show, then there's a link to buying us a coffee in the description of this episode. Do you want to say what next week's quote is, George?
There is no expedient to which a man will not resort to avoid the labor of thinking. Thomas Edison.
Ooh, I'm going to have a proper think about that one.
So if you guys got any thoughts about the quote, then you can send us a message on Instagram or send us an email. We'll link both of those down in the show notes so you can check them out.
Cool. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. See you next week, guys.
See you next week.